Ho, ho, ho. Welcome to this week's episode of Abbie Thoughts. I was thinking this week about the story of Saint Nicholas. I wonder why. I thought Saint Nicholas was something to do with Lapland. I definitely wanted to know more about the story that surrounds this much loved seasonal time of ours. So I thought, why not have a look to see if there's anything to the story of Santa Claus? What do we know about this person? Was he this great stand-up guy as famed? So, basically, Saint Nicholas of Myra. He was a Christian bishop of Greek descent. He was born and lived in modern-day Turkey in the time of the Roman Empire. He was around from 270 AD to 343 AD. If you know your Roman Empire history, that should make sense to you. He was said to have performed a lot of miracles in his life, so he also went by the name of Nicholas the Wonder Worker, which is very Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and they do share a connection as they were both intent on making children obese. Sorry, they were nice to children. So Saint Nicholas is the patron saint of sailors, sailors, merchants, archers, because we have so many of those, repentant thieves, children, brewers, pawnbrokers, unmarried people, way, and students in all the various cities and countries in Europe. So I think that's quite a fun bunch of people who get to call on quite a decent saint with a good track record. Students, unmarried people, if you're feeling the blues this Christmas, remember that St. Nicholas is the guy. You can call on him, he does get it. And his reputation arose among early Christians. They did like to have a good goss session, so they were always sharing if anybody was up to something miraculous. And he had this really horrible habit of secretly giving gifts to people. Ugh, just dropping them off in places, knowing that they were needed and not letting on that it was him giving the gifts. So that is where we get that idea of gift giving and leaving gifts for people. And, Santa being a gift giver, he paved the way for us all because that is what he used to do. A lot of the stories people read about him were only written down 100 to 200 years after he passed away. So some people do say, well, it's not exactly the most trustworthy source. But they do also say that there is no smoke without fire. So it's likely there is something to the stories people told about him, and we can trust some of it. We can sort of believe he was relatively like the general picture that people paint of him. He is said to have been born in a Turkish seaport city to wealthy Christians, so not the worst start in life, I guess. A very famous story about him. He is said to have rescued three girls from being forced into prostitution. So the ancients, they are just like us, also having to deal with human trafficking. He dropped a sack of gold coins through the window into their house every night for 3 nights, so that their father could pay a dowry for each of them. Without that money, they would have had to marry really unsuitable people because they would have had no dowry, so no value to anybody. So he really saved them from a not so great situation. He is also said to have calmed a storm at sea. He was on board, and it meant everyone felt secure and was able to finish the journey in peace. And he is also said to have saved 3 innocent soldiers from wrongful execution. In his youth, he made a pilgrimage to Egypt and Palestine, so 2 great holidays for Roman Empire times. After his return from these pilgrimages, he had obviously moved into a more spiritual phase in his life, a lot more enlightened. And it is after his return that he becomes the Bishop of Myra at quite a young age. He was also cast into prison, so he did do time, as all our great saints tend to do, and he really suffered during the persecution of Diocletian, which is a really bad persecution that those who are aware of Christian history do remember. This was a particularly bad time for Christians. A lot of Christians went through this time. A lot of Christians lost their life during this time, and he was one of the people caught up in this particular persecution during the reign of Diocletian. He was released, though, from prison after Constantine came to the throne and got very Christiany with everybody. And Constantine, he had his own conversion, and he felt that all the Christians at the time weren't the monsters that the locals were making them out to be, and that they did deserve to be released and allowed to live their life. So St. Nicholas passed away around 343 CE or AD, well, technically CE, and they put his bones in a church, the Basilica de Saint Nicolai. I wonder why they called it that. And that church was in Bari in Italy. And his bones were there for quite a while. People were very into bone pilgrimages in those days, on into the Middle Ages type of time. And the bones stayed there until the Venetians took his most of his bones to Venice, and that is where you can find Saint Nick today. If you feel like doing a slightly creepy, or is it fun, potentially childhood scarring Christmas treasure hunt, you can go and see Saint Nicholas's bones in Venice. So even without the so-called miracles, Saint Nick was a bishop. So I feel as though even if we didn't know about the gift giving and the saving people from storms, it was already something that he was a bishop. It's not the easiest gig in the world to make your parishioners pay for your villa on the Aegean Sea. No, I kid. I'm sure he was doing the hard grunt work of having to lead a church, making sure your parishioners aren't doing anything insane, and all the work that goes with being a bishop. So, hats off to him just for having to deal with that role. And he also took time to address a lot of false teachings that were around at the time, and that forms an important part of Christian history. So again, he was in the trenches, pushing forward in the work that he felt was important at the time. And so this year, I hope you feel you can better reflect on why you were giving those gifts secretly or openly. There was this person, he was very useful and he helped people as he was able to. And there you have it, St. Nicholas, good old Santa Claus. And another thing on my mind this week has been the winter weather that we've been having. It's been very hard going and very cold. And I just keep wondering, is it related to climate change? This year, as well as 2020 in Manchester, these were both very cold, very dark, quite unnatural weather, even for this northern clime of ours. And I have felt at times this must be related to climate change, right? So I read some newspapers that were saying, no, 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 it's totally unrelated. We've just been unlucky. But then I read through a few other reports, and most of the experts are saying the cold weather is related to climate change. When I hear global warming, I sort of assume, well, doesn't that mean we're going to get warmer temperatures? The sea levels are going to rise, everything is going to melt. But global warming also means we are going to be seeing more extreme weather, and that includes having colder winters. Heating in the Arctic disturbs the circular pattern of winds known as the polar vortex. So the polar vortex, those giant swirling winds above the poles, it is just cold air. And you have a polar vortex at each of the poles, north and south, and that polar vortex keeps cold air trapped in those areas. So if the polar vortex is affected by anything, like they currently are, then that circular pattern starts to weaken and loosen, and the cold air starts to travel down. And that's what you see happening now, which is extremely cold Arctic air traveling down into the UK and into the US. what's caused that polar vortex to stretch is the increased heat in the Arctic atmosphere. So global warming is what's affecting the polar vortex, and the increased heat in the atmosphere that's coming from the melting ice is what is that extra energy from the extra heat is traveling up and affecting the cold air and the vortex. This sounds very Star Wars, but it really is just climate change science. There's been an increase in these stretching events over the last few years, and the cold air is coming not just into the UK, but it's entering into countries it never did before. In 2021, Spain had minus 25 degrees centigrade temperatures, which is really unlike Spain, and Greece had snow, which is fairly unusual. And then you also had the US, Texas, which is normally like a desert, had sub-zero temperatures. So we are seeing these stranger climate events. Over time, we probably will have fewer instances of cold weather, but when the cold does happen, it will be more extreme. So you may even see snow in March, that kind of thing. So right now is the time to buy your onesies, apparently. You also have the jet streams. They're also part of why we're having colder weather. And the jet streams, that's where the colder northern air meets the warmer southern air, and that boundary, that line where you sort of get the northern climate meeting that kind of equator southern climate, if there's a strong jet stream, that's boundary, everything's okay, and the cold air will stay in the north where it's supposed to, and the warm air will stay in the south where it's supposed to. But if the jet stream starts to weaken, again, because something is happening in the oceans and currents are getting confused and the air and the pressure isn't moving the way it's supposed to move, then that jet stream starts to give way, and the cold air will start to go wherever it wants to go, and the hot air will start to go wherever it wants to go, and things just won't stay in regular pattern as they used to do. So you do need to watch out for unusually cold weather to continue, because things are getting jumbled up in the atmosphere, and all over the poles, things are sort of changing slightly. And what that means is our UK winters aren't going to be as wet and mild as they normally are. But we may be able to find ways to affect our jet streams positively and try and return things to what they should be. That's all I know for now. But on a less chilly note, I have recently finished watching 2 seasons of F-Boy Island, and I can only recommend it. It is so good and worth the watch. If you need to feel some Christmas cheer, do go ahead, and you will be gifted with something wonderful, I'm sure. And that is all the things that have been in my thoughts this week. Do let me know if you learned anything that you weren't aware of about St. Nicholas, and if you'll be giving any especially strange gifts this season. And all the best from myself. Stay merry. Bye.